Welcome to our webinar dealing with a tough winter from PPS. My name's Debbie Shea and I assist Rob with some of the work with PPS. And today we have Jess Revell from Rumenate Livestock Services joining us to talk about productive grazing with the feed management results that we have from the MLA PDS project, and using information from the PPS Grass to Dollars training course. Jess is a principal and animal production consultant involved with livestock nutrition and animal production over the past 12 years. I must mention we do clash with an AgVic workshop today that's on at the same time, unfortunately, with Clem Sternfels. But both webinars are being recorded, so we can have the opportunity to watch them at another date. So welcome to you all, and I'd like to pass across to Jess to run the webinar. Thanks, Jess.
Great, thanks, Debbie. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the Dealing with a Tough Winter webinar. Just having a few technical issues here. So today we're going to talk about the season, give you a seasonal update. There's no denying that it has been a very tough season for everyone. We're going to look at what our livestock require right now. So July going into August and how high those requirements are. We're going to look at some of the strategies for planning ahead, such as early weaning and some of the trigger points around that. And then what can we do beyond weaning for both our breeding stock and our young stock to get some average or some good average daily gains in those young animals. So there is no denying it has been a really tough winter. You've fed for a long period of time. Everyone's sick of feeding, and supplements are starting to run out for the majority of you. It has been one of the driest winters on record. So I heard some data today from AgVic that suggested that it was the driest in the Hamilton area since 1967. So up until 2 weeks ago, we'd class that as a drought, and now in some areas, it's being classed as a green drought. So it has been very dry and a huge feed deficit. Looking at the slide, this is a table put together by Tom Morgan, or late Tom Morgan from AgVic, on the pasture growth rates. He analysed those from 1980 through to 2005. And I've just put together from 2000 to 2005, just so you can see the various growth rates in the Wimmera region or the Ararat region, and how, or the average growth rates through July and August. That mean is from 1980 through to 2005, so an average of 9 kilos of dry matter a hectare for July, and an average of 17 kilos of dry matter a hectare for August. So while those growth rates are quite low, we've significantly had lower growth rates than those up until probably 2 weeks ago, where there was no moisture around. So what are some of the positives going forward? Majority of areas have had rain. That rain has been variable, but the soil profile has still a long way to go. So again, some data out of AgVic today. In some areas, the soil profile has only filled up by 30%. In some areas, that's 57%. So we've still got a long period of saturation before that soil profile fills, before we get any decent pasture growth. And we still haven't had a really cold snap yet either. So there has been a few frosts around, but certainly there's going to be a cold, well, typically there would be a cold period of weather before that spring period and that pasture growth. So really important not to budget on pasture growth at the moment. There might be a little bit in the paddock, but certainly if you take anything away from the webinar is to keep feeding for the next 6 to 8 weeks and let your pasture wedge build. So I'm finding there's a lot of mentality to eat what is coming up in terms of growth rate, those nice green shoots, but it's going to catch us at the end when we go to wean and have limited growth in weaner paddocks, and then have to continue feeding for a longer period of time. So if you can, try not to eat into that growing point. Some more positives is the livestock markets are starting to increase. So if we have a look at that stock and land headline, this was from social media yesterday, a near vertical spike in the Finnish cattle market. So we're starting to see that rise in cattle prices. And then lambs were $10 a kilo in Ballarat a couple of weeks ago. So we're starting to see that lamb market move as well, which is some positives out of a really tough winter. So as I said, this little bit of moisture around and the mild days, I'm aware that there has been some frost, but days are quite mild compared to a typical winter. And we're starting to see these nice, juicy green shoots come through. They're full of water-soluble carbohydrates, so sugars, and our livestock love to chase that green pick because of that. So it's like all of these lollies starting to grow through the paddock, which they love to chase and eat first. But ideally, we're sort of sitting in this situation before the rain. So we've had limited to no pasture growth or really short green feed. And because it's been so dry, we're not getting that root system go down through the soil profile. So it's just sitting at the surface until it's rained and it can start to go through that soil profile and find some moisture. So if we graze now and graze into those short green shoots, then we're going to get more root dieback, and we're also going to eat into the growing point of those nice juicy green shoots, which means our rotations, or when we go to graze those paddocks again, are going to be a lot longer to recover because we're eating into that growing point, which slows the recovery of that pasture down. So ideally, we want to try and wait for at least another 8 weeks, pending on your area and how much pasture you've got available, to allow those leaves to grow, send up more solar panels to the sun to grow more leaves, and have some decent feed available in 2 months when potentially we're going to wean animals onto those paddocks. So really important now not to eat into that growing point if you can. I know it's very tempting and we have been feeding for a long period of time. Feed costs are very high, but if we can wait just another 6 to 8 weeks, pending on your area, to try and allow that leaf system and that root system to recover, then it will benefit you coming into spring. So if we look at our breeding stock requirements, where are they at the moment? So this table is out of Lifetime ewe. If we were looking at maintenance requirement of a 50 kilo ewe, she requires 8 megajoules a day of energy. A 60 kilo ewe requires around 9.3 megajoules of energy. So if we put rams out on the 1st of March, they're around 145 days pregnant. They're about to lamb or are lambing already. And so she requires around 18 megajoules of energy as a twin-bearing ewe at the point of lambing. If we put our ewes out on our rams out on the 1st of February, they're around 25 days into lactation. So they require the most energy that they'll need through that pregnancy and lactation cycle because they're about to peak in milk production. So that's when they need the most glucose and their energy requirements are the highest. So if we look there at a twin-bearing 60 kilo ewe at 30 days pregnant, she requires 29.6 megajoules of energy, which is a huge amount of feed if we don't have pasture in the paddock at the moment. If we put our rams out on the 1st of January, we're around 56 days into lactation. So that ewe has peaked in milk production where her energy requirement will be the highest, and her energy requirements are now starting to drop off. She still needs a huge amount of energy at 23.7 megajoules, but every 10-day block, her energy requirements will start to decrease. And then if we put our rams out on the 1st of December, they're around 87 days into lactation and are coming down off that peak of energy and are needing less energy than those other 3 classes of ewes. Just something to note on the right-hand side table, there's a confinement fed column. When we put our ewes into containment or to confinement, we drop their energy requirement by around 20% on average. So if we do go through this period of a feed deficit again next year, then just be mindful that when we do contain those ewes in a smaller area, they're using less energy. We can reduce our feed bill and their energy requirement by around 20%. So this is what their energy requirement looks like. We see in the middle there is a bar that says lambing. So essentially their glucose requirement keeps increasing past lambing because that's when they peak in milk production. 20 to 30 days after lambing is when their highest energy requirement is demanded. In the solid line, we have our twin energy requirement. In the single line or the single dotted line, we have our single ewe requirement. So she needs the most energy in that peak of milk production to support her requirement, essentially, for producing milk for those lambs. And typically, in a normal season, we've always had pasture at this time of year and have never had to feed so excessively. So really seeing some issues with ewes lambing and lactating and how those lambs are growing because on average, we're not feeding enough in terms of supplements. For those of you with cattle, what do their energy requirements look like? So if we take a 500 kilo cow, they require around 61 megajoules of energy. In that last 3 months, where that fetus growth is around 70% of growth, they require around 74 megajoules of energy. And once they start lactating for that first 3 months, when she will peak in milk production, 6 to 8 weeks after calving, she requires 90 megajoules of energy. And we see her crude protein requirements down the side. So this table comes from the AgVic website or More Beef from Pastures. Typically, I would formulate these diets at a higher protein level to support their requirements. So if we're looking at these tables, use the energy values, but I'll give you the protein requirements in a couple of slides. So what does their curve look like? Essentially, cattle will peak in milk production 6 to 8 weeks after calving, but their dry matter intake doesn't peak until 10 to 11 weeks later. So while she needs the most energy to produce milk for that calf 6 to 8 weeks after calving, she can't physically eat enough until 10 to 11 weeks later. So we need to feed a really high energy density diet to ensure that she's producing milk at a high rate. At the same time, because her glucose demand is so high, she is utilizing live weight to support that glucose demand, but the way we feed her will minimize how much live weight she loses. So she will naturally lose some live weight, the same with a ewe or some body condition to support that high glucose mentality, but our feeding program, the aim is to reduce how much she does lose. So the things I'm seeing at the moment, because these energy demands are so high to produce milk, if you have lambed or if you have calved, is loss of body condition. Because if our diet's not supporting their huge energy requirement, then they'll utilize their own fat stores as an energy source to support that requirement. So whether that's fetal growth in those later stages of pregnancy, or whether that's milk production for both ewes and cows, they'll utilize their own body fat to try and support that energy requirement if we're not feeding them enough. And what we're seeing hugely in our industry at the moment, or in the Western districts at the moment, is a massive issue with pregnancy toxemia or an energy deficiency. Because we're simply not meeting the energy requirement of that ewe or that cow because they demand so much energy at this time of year. So pregnancy toxemia, or ketosis, as it's known in cattle, is basically utilizing the body fat of that ewe or that cow, which goes to the liver and gets converted into these things through a number of processes called ketone bodies. So she will naturally always utilize some body condition, but we don't want her to utilize excessive amounts because those ketone bodies go into the bloodstream and they can become toxic to the ewe or to the cow at really high levels. That puts a demand on glucose drain from the brain. And that's why we get mortalities due to pregnancy toxemia or ketosis, is because we utilize all the energy in the brain. These ketone bodies are toxic in the bloodstream, and then the animal goes down with pregtox or ketosis. So when we look at minimizing that, if you are seeing ewes go down, basically we need to feed a more energy dense diet. And because her intake is limited when she peaks in milk production, that doesn't increase until later, then hay is not energy dense enough to be able to support her requirements. So if we are feeding hay and grain, then our supplementary feed program should increase the energy density of the diet with grain to be able to support her demand for glucose, because the starch in cereal grains gets broken down and converted to glucose. I'm also seeing a lot of early lambs not thriving. So those lambs that are being marked now, having issues with either growth rate or mortalities around marking. And putting that down to that loss of body condition score of the ewe. So she's utilizing that fat store to meet her energy requirements, but that is meaning that she's producing less milk. And I think a lot of these issues of poor growth rates in lamb, or those early lambs that were born, and mortality is due to that ewe not giving that lamb enough milk, or the quality of that milk has declined because our feed programs aren't supporting her huge demand at the moment. The other thing I'm seeing is protein's really limited in these diets. So when that ewe's lactating, she requires around 16% crude protein. And normally we've had pasture high in nitrogen that's typically around 16 to 25% protein at this time of year that would support her huge protein requirement. But because protein supplements at the moment are increasing in price, things like lupins and beans, significantly higher in cost, and our vetches and lucerne hays are either scarce or the quality is a lot poorer if you can find them, that protein's not being met in our supplementary feed program at the moment. So the first thing protein does when we feed a protein supplement is the microbes use the nitrogen in protein to convert that to ammonia, and then they absorb that into their body in the presence of an energy source, such as their cereal grain or pasture if we have it, to use it as a substrate to grow and reproduce. So if we're not utilizing, or if we're not feeding enough protein at the moment, we don't have microbes or enough microbes in the rumen to utilize those energy sources, and we're getting really poor rumen function. So we're feeding these high cost supplements, but they're not being utilized efficiently in the rumen. The other thing protein does for ewes is it is a building block for milk production. So milk protein is critical to those lambs thriving. So if we're not feeding enough protein in our diet, then we're getting poor quality milk production. In our young animals, protein is the building blocks of muscle development as well. So if the lamb's not getting enough protein out of the milk, then that could be a reason why they are dropping in average daily gain. They're just not putting on the weight to support that growth rate requirement and not laying down that muscle component. And poor rumen function looks like this. So when we've got a really high fibrous diet, or we're not feeding enough protein in the rumen to make microbes, then they're really poor at digesting our energy sources. So we get these pellet-like manure scores for ewes, or we get manure built up like towers in cattle, and you'll physically see the long pieces of fiber through that manure score because it's not being efficiently digested within the rumen. So what are our crude protein targets? For maintenance, we're looking at 8 to 10% to really support that microbe growth. For pregnancy and fetal requirements, looking around 12% until that last 6 weeks of pregnancy. We want to try and target 14% during that time, and then 16% while she's lactating, or we've got young animals or weaners, aiming for that 16% crude protein diet, depending on their live weight. And now comes the strategy for early weaning, which is a popular topic in our industry at the moment. And it's because of the feed deficit and really setting up weaner paddocks to be able to support their requirements for average daily gain when we do go to wean those animals. So the benefits of early weaning, it really benefits the breeding animal, so the ewe or the cow, because at the moment, if we're pulling off body condition score, it's going to take a while for her to regain that body condition score so she's in a good body condition at the point of joining or when those rams or bulls go in to really support that conception rate and that fertility requirement. The other gain is through improved efficiency or average daily gain throughput of those weaners. So weaning is a direct benefit to the cow or ewe because we allow her enough time to regain body condition ready for next joining, but an indirect benefit to the calf or lamb because we can really focus our feeding program on really driving average daily gain of those young animals. The other benefit is reducing our stocking rate. So in a year where we've got limited pasture growth, pasture seems to be growing at the moment with that little bit of moisture if you've had it and these mild days. But as I said before, it hasn't come in cold yet. So we really want to allow those weaner paddocks to be set up for a good growth rate when we do go to wean those animals. But what it does is it takes the pressure off because we reduce the intake of the ewe because we only set her back and feed her a maintenance diet once we wean those lambs or those calves. So if we look at a 60 kilo ewe and lamb, a lactating twin ewe, she's classed as around 2.8 DSE and requires around 23 megajoules a day to support milk requirement for those two lambs. When we go to wean that animal or wean that lamb, that 60 kilo ewe drops back to a maintenance requirement. So she doesn't have to eat as much. She's classed as 1.12, which is just over 9 megajoules of energy that she needs. And our weaner, to really drive their growth rate, requires around 17.6 megajoules a day. Requires around 1 DSE, which is 8.3 megajoules a day. So overall, that ewe at maintenance and that lamb is classed as 17.6 megajoules a day. So what early weaning does is reduces that feed requirement by around 20 to 30% on all the trials that have been done through that early weaning program. If we look at this in a cattle scenario and just taking into account a 500 kilo cow and calf, lactating at 3 to 9 months, that unit is classed as 15.4 DSE, which is 131 megajoules a day. When we go to wean that calf, we drop that cow back to a maintenance diet. She's classed as 5.4 DSE. If our calves, for instance, are weaned at 200 kilos, growing at a kilo a day, they're classed as 7.7 DSE. So now their overall DSE rating is 111 megajoules a day. So it significantly drops our stocking pressure, but also reduces feed requirements by weaning those animals earlier. But the key is to set them up pre-weaning to be able to do that earlier. So what's achievable? Typically in a typical season where we do have pasture growth, we would say around 12 to 14 weeks from the start of lambing, or a minimum target live weight of 45% of standard reference weight. And standard reference weight just being the weight of a dry ewe in body condition score 3 with no gut feel or fleece. So we're basing our 45% on a dry ewe weight at condition score 3 with no gut feel and no fleece. Or we might wean when ewe body condition score drops below 3. But in a failed season or where we've got a feed, we're coming out of a feed deficit, it is achievable in drought situations to wean them at 10 kilos if we had to. So I know that's been done in New South Wales in severe droughts, but those lambs were set up to do that. So they were fed milk replacer when they were weaned so light, but they were already used to grain. And it allowed that rumen function to be stimulated, that papillae growth, and those survival rates were a lot better because their rumen function was already stimulated. So if you look at that live weight target in a typical year, 45% of standard reference weight of a 60 kilo ewe is 27 kilos minimum weaning weight. And that is just where survival rates are highest. So AWI has done a lot of work on early weaning. There's a Winning with Weaners program. And this data comes out of that program because that live weight target is where survival rates were best. So targets for weaners and ewe replacements, ideally they're birthed around 8 to 9% of standard reference weight. In a typical year, we would wean them at 45% of standard reference weight. By the autumn break, we want them at 50% of standard reference weight, depending on when you're weaning and when you're lambing. By late winter, around 60%. And then when we go to mate them as maidens, our target would be to have them at 75 to 80% of standard reference weight. So even if your lambing pattern doesn't look like this, they are the live weight targets that we're aiming for in a typical season. So that gap from weaning at 45% to the autumn break in this scenario is quite small. So we're trying to aim for a minimum daily weight gain of 50 grams, but survival rates are far better if we can get that weaning average daily gain up to around 150 grams a day. So if we can have those weaners growing at that average daily gain, then their survival rates are far better than if they're growing at around 30 grams a day. For those of you with cattle, typically in our industry, weaners are generally weaned at 9 to 10 months. Ideally 6 months, pending the season and pasture availability, is achievable. In a dry and drought situation, it's common for weaners to be weaned around 100 days or at 4 months. And again, our decision to wean might be around when that body condition score falls below that 3 body condition score. But again, really setting that rumen up to be able to achieve those early weaning rates if we are looking at this early weaning process. And a similar amount of live weight percentage. So we want them weaned around 45% of standard reference weight in a typical season, by puberty reaching 50% of standard reference weight, at breeding 65%, and then by first calving, they should be 85% of target weight. And depending on what your mature standard reference weight is, which you see on the left, then there is a joining weight target and a calving weight target based on those live weight percentages. So if we are looking at early weaning, whenever you wean from now onwards, pending on when you lambed, is to do or to setting them up to survive post-weaning is really allowing that rumen to develop in that pre-weaning phase. So if we look at this milk curve, as we said before, at 20 to 30 days after lambing, we get that peak in milk production. And then that drops off. So again, the solid line is a twin ewe milk production, and the dotted line is a single ewe milk production. It's a similar curve for cattle. As we've seen before, it's just over a longer period of time. They peak in milk production at 6 to 8 weeks. So once we've peaked in milk production, then that energy requirement starts to reduce. So by 8 weeks of age, milk only makes up around 5 to 10% of the diet of a lamb. By that time, the lamb should be eating solid feed, have good rumen development, and really is getting no benefit from the milk of that ewe. So as long as we've set that lamb up well from peak milk production, then essentially we can wean that animal. The young animal, so a lamb or calf born, is born with a monogastric stomach like us. So all that milk goes into this tube called the esophagus, which has a flap of skin known as the esophageal groove, and passes milk straight into the abomasum, where it is broken down through acid digestion, it clots and is absorbed into the bloodstream. So we have to stimulate that rumen by what we feed that lamb or that calf to be developed. As that calf or lamb starts to eat solid feed like pasture, that esophageal groove will eventually open and it'll pass feed straight into the rumen where the rumen's stimulated and that animal can start to function like a ruminant. And that's our aim with early weaning, is to try and get that earlier rumen development. So how does feed impact rumen development? If we were to feed a milk-only diet, which is on the left-hand side, the inside of the rumen would be quite smooth. If we were to feed a milk and hay diet, which is on the right-hand side, the inside of the rumen would be more muscular because hay creates mixing and muscular textures on the rumen wall. But again, that rumen wall would be quite smooth. Once we add starch into that diet, that gets broken down in the rumen to these things called volatile fatty acids. And starch produces propanoate and butyrate, and it's butyrate that causes this budding on the rumen wall. And that is known as papillae. So it's like having a toweling effect on the rumen wall. And that's how the lamb or the calf absorbs nutrients. So the more toweling or these finger-like projections we can stimulate on the rumen wall, the better the growth rate post-weaning, because it's got a higher nutrient absorbing surface area to absorb more nutrients to put into weight gain. And how do we do that? We do that through imprint and creep feeding a starch-based supplement. And lambs and calves should be well set up this year, having been mostly grain-fed, depending on your diet, to have this good rumen stimulation because we've had to feed the ewe or the cow. So ideally, imprint feeding is feeding the lamb or the calf with their mother. So the mother teaches them how to eat the feed and how to feed from feeding equipment. So the lamb remembers that when they're weaned, and they will get on to feed and use feeding equipment a lot easier than they will if they've never been imprint fed. But at the same time, once we're feeding a starch-based supplement, it is stimulating those papillae on the rumen wall to create more surface area to be able to absorb more nutrients post-weaning. Creep feeding systems are basically shutting the mother off if she's in good body condition. So again, assessing body condition score at marking this year to ensure that we are feeding enough, but also do we creep feed will be the question. So if those ewes or cows are still in poor body condition, then essentially we wouldn't be creep feeding. We would be feeding both the ewe and cow and lamb and calf unit. Other rumen stimulants, as Rob alluded to in his marketing for this webinar, nutritionists have one stomach and a fake stomach. This stomach in the container is basically a diagram of the rumen. So within the rumen, all that feed is suspended in liquid, and that's what we want to achieve when we're weaning animals. And the way we wean those animals will determine whether they have enough liquid or not. So water is really important to that weaner. We also want to create a really good fiber mat within the rumen to be able to trap our more digestible feeds, such as grain or our really lush pastures, to be able to be more slowly digested within the rumen. So fiber is key when we're going to wean these animals to allow this rumen to function effectively. So moisture and a good fiber mat to slow the digestion of feed down is critical to improving the weight gains of our weaners. Minimizing stress at weaning is really important because that can allow the wheels to fall off if we don't minimize stress through our weaning process. So it's really important to remember that our calf or our lamb is just a baby. So it's used to being with its mother. All it's known is to follow its mother around and do whatever she does. So the way she eats, that lamb or that calf will remember what she eats. The way she feeds from feeding equipment. If she's climbing through fences, then the lamb will remember how to do that. Whatever that mother does, then the young will mimic that mother. So really important to remember that our calf and our lamb is just a baby and is used to being with its mother. So how we wean that animal will determine the amount of stress in those first 2 to 3 days of that weaning process. So if we place a heap of stress on that lamb or that calf, a few different things happen. And we've done all this really good work to set the rumen up by supplementary feeding. We're feeding starch. We've got a really good papillae development to absorb nutrients. We abruptly wean that animal, take it away for its mother, which is all it's known, and we place this huge stress on the animal. So that reduces appetite, so reduces feed intake, which changes conditions in the rumen. So those papillae will start to retract under stressful conditions, which means less nutrient absorption. If that animal's under severe stress, then they will urinate and defecate at a higher rate, which means that that animal starts to dehydrate. And all of that together causes a drop in the immune system. So they're more prone to picking up disease, and all of that combined reduces our average daily gain on that weaner. In the picture here, we see lambs that have been abruptly weaned into a yard. So they've been run through the yards and their mothers had been taken away swiftly. And those lambs sitting down look like they're resting, but they are under severe heat stress. So those lambs were panting, they had their tongues hanging out. Those lambs, once they went out into their weaner paddock, were the tail in the mob the entire time. Because they were under severe stress, it changed conditions in the rumen. They were less able to absorb more nutrients, and they were the tail in the mob, that last 20% within the mob, the entire time. So the amount of stress placed on that animal can have a significant weight gain, reduction in weight gain through the life of that animal. And this is what happens in the rumen. So we change the conditions. We go from setting up this beautiful rumen in that pre-weaning phase to absorb more nutrients, to putting that animal under severe stress. That changes the pH within the rumen, and we can get different things happen, like that contraction of the papillae, or if it's severe enough, it might burn or slay those papillae off the rumen wall, which never come back, which means that animal is less able to absorb nutrients and drops its average daily gain. Socialization is also really important. The photo in front of you shows two different breeds of sheep, South Downs and Suffolks, and they were mobbed together and they were brought into the yards to be body condition scored, and then they were run together within the yards. And at the time when we were doing this in Dubbo, we went and had lunch and then come back, and they had self-drafted themselves back into their own mobs. So you see there, the South Downs are all standing together, which is the mob they'd been in. So socialization is a really big effect on that weaner. So if they've never seen their pen mates before or their paddock mates before, it does place a stress on that animal. So being aware of what mobs you're putting together, but being aware of how much time it takes to get used to a new animal. And the research says sort of 7 to 10 days it takes to recognize a new animal. So if we are mobbing mobs together, then essentially is that a stress that we can reduce in that pre-weaning phase. So getting mobs used to each other before we wean those lambs together. But it's not always achievable on everyone's property. So ideally we want to keep as many things the same as possible. So the ration that weaner's had pre-weaning, we want to make sure that the ration's the same post-weaning. So we don't get that poor rumen function. If you can, take the ewe and lamb to the weaner paddock, keep them there for a few hours or half a day so they get used to that paddock, and then take the ewe away. So the only thing that's different is the mum leaves, but they're already used to the feed in the paddock. That's one way of reducing stress rather than really abruptly weaning. There's also some work being done in our industry on yard weaning lambs as well, and the reduction in stress and improvement in average daily gain like they're doing in the cattle industry. Pasture targets for weaner paddocks is 1,500 to 1,800 kilos coming out of the information through various programs like Lifetime View or Winning with Weaners. If you're not going to be at this rate by the time you go to wean, then that is a good opportunity to early wean and not be afraid to put them into containment to wean them to allow your pasture wedge to be built. So you can feed them a far effective or a balanced diet within containment to their requirements than putting them out on lower quality pasture than those targets and then having them fall behind because we didn't have the amount of pasture available. So certainly this year we will see a lot more weaning into containments because we can't meet those pasture targets. So what do our weaners require when we go to wean them, no matter what age we're weaning them at? In front of you, I want you to think about this being your own weaner paddock. Hopefully we've got some paddocks that look like this by the time we do go to wean. And you've gone through and done a pluck test and you've had this feed tested. And that's come back at a dry matter of 25.5%, 11 megajoules of energy, a crude protein of 16%, an NDF of 56.8, and a digestibility of 70%. So if that was a feed test we got back, we might think that that's a really good feed to wean our weaners onto. And if they're eating a kilo of that feed, then it would be. So we see here 11 megajoules per kilo. So if they were eating a kilo of dry matter, they'd be getting 11 megajoules. We see here 16% protein, which means it's 162 grams of protein per kilo. But due to the fiber level, what if I said that they could only physically eat half a kilo of that feed, which means they're getting not 11 megajoules, they're getting half of 11 megajoules, so around 5 megajoules of energy. Half of 16.2 or 162 grams is around 8% protein. So because they physically can't eat a kilo, then they're not getting the benefits of this high quality energy and protein feed. So we put our weaners out there thinking visually that it looks like a good feed. And then we might come back 6 to 8 weeks later and they look like this. So these feed tests have been taken out of the MLA feed quality project by Perennial Pasture Systems. And it's the NDF or the fiber component that's really limiting intake when we're grazing these pastures that we think visually look quite good. So we come back and our weaners have significantly lost a lot of weight because the NDF or the fiber within those pastures is high and it limits intake. So these feed tests were taken from the feed quality project in September of 23, and the NDF was 46%. So our 25 kilo weaner requires growing at 100 grams a day, requires 8 megajoules of energy and 14% protein. Because that NDF is 46%, we can do a calculation, 120 divided by the NDF percentage of the feed times the live weight of the animal means that animal can physically eat 0.65 kilos of dry matter per day. We times that by the energy value on our feed test, which means the intake of that pasture is 7.3 megajoules. So we're not quite meeting our 8 megajoule requirement, which means visually we might not notice when we first put weaners out there that they could be losing weight. This feed test was taken in October of 23. The NDF was 55.9. So it increased quite significantly, but visually it looked like what was in the previous photo. So while the fiber was increasing, the feed still visually looked like good quality weaner feed. We do that calculation again, and that animal can only eat half a kilo. 120 divided by 55.9 times 25 kilos means that that animal can eat half a kilo in dry matter per day. We times that by the energy value on our feed test, which means that that animal is only intaking 5.3 megajoules. And there's a huge deficit. So potential intake of half a kilo, they need 8 megajoules a day, which means there's a deficit of 2.7 megajoules or 54 grams per week. So when we initially put those weaners out there, we don't probably visually notice the weight gain loss, but we come back 8 weeks later and that's what they look like. They've visually lost weight on what we thought was good quality feed. So if you look at some data just on Phalaris as an example that was taken out of the feed quality project in September, We see really lush pastures throughout various sites, through Ararat down to Moyston, and up across to Strawl. High moisture feeds in September on these phalaris pastures. Really high protein. So remember, our weaners only need 16%. Those pastures were supplying upwards of 20%. We see that Elos Merthyr pasture, phalaris pasture, was providing 29% crude protein. And that has other effects on the animal, other negative weight gain effects, because it takes energy to break that down. But we'll go through that later. The fiber level was also reasonably low at 44% NDF, and really good metabolizable energy level, around 10s to 12s per kilo. However, in October, and remember this feed looked like it did on the left of this, the right of the slide, dry matter started to increase slightly. Crude protein significantly dropped, but the feed still visually looked green, and NDF significantly increased. And this was towards the end of October in 23. So we start to get in the 56s, 60% NDF, and that has a major impact on feed intake, which affects average daily gain of weaners. Reasonable energy levels around 9s to 10s, but it depends on how much they're eating as to what they're intaking. So if we wanted to balance that ration for weaners going out on that pasture, and if we don't have that pasture available in the next couple of months when we do go to wean those weaners, the phalaris pasture, or the NDF component here on the left-hand side, it could be a hay-based diet that we're looking at. So if we look at our phalaris or hay-based diet, they're eating 0.5 kilo. And then to add barley into that, we'd need to add 240 grams to balance that 8 megajoule requirement and reduce that 2.7 megajoule deficit. So that would cost us around 13 cents per head per day over that feeding period to really drive that sort of low growth rate of 100 grams per head per day. If we have heavier weaners at 35 kilos and we're wanting them to grow at 200 grams a day, they require 21 megajoules of energy and 16% protein. So that's the same energy requirement as a ewe at the point of lambing, depending on her live weight. So to grow at an average type growth rate at 200 grams, they require a significant amount of energy and also a high protein diet. So again, out of the pasture systems feed quality project, one of the pastures tested around, or a majority, the average of pastures tested around 73% NDF. We do that calculation again. They can eat 0.5 kilo. Based on the energy level of the feed test is 6 megajoules. We times that by 0.5 kilo, which means that they're intaking 3.4 megajoules off these pastures. And remember, this is weaner feed in October, November in our area, which looked green, but still creating these high NDFs, which is limiting intake and dropping growth rates in weaners. So to balance that diet, if that's phalaris or if that's a hay-based diet at the moment, we would need to feed around 1.2 kilos of barley and 0.5 kilo of lupins to support that 21 megajoule a day requirement and 16% protein. So at 66 cents a day over 80 days, that's $52.80 if we're looking to get them to a saleable weight, a heavier weight across, or put on another 25 kilos. If we look at a 200 kilo weaner requirement in terms of cattle, for maintenance, they require 26 megajoules. If we wanted them to gain at 1 kilo a day, an average growth rate, then they would need an additional 44 megajoules, additional 33 megajoules, which means it's 59 megajoules a day overall. So again, a significant energy and protein requirement to support that 1 kilo of weight gain, which is similar to a cow that is just calved. So just finishing off with some of the results of that feed quality project in the area, and being mindful that these graphs show when requirements dropped for a weaner growing at 25 kilos at 100 grams a day, needing 14% protein, or a dry sheep at 50 kilos at condition score 3, needing 8% protein. So basically on the feed test, when that feed dropped below that requirement, and the month that it dropped. So in the yellow line, we see weaner requirements. In the red line, we see dry sheep maintenance requirements. So we see here by the 21st of October, feed, we're looking at Phalaris here, feed had already started to decline below weaner requirements. So weaners growing at that rate require 14 to 16% protein. In our area, grazing those Phalaris pastures, it had already dropped by the 21st of October below those requirements and continued to decline. For maintenance requirements, we started to see that significant decline below 8%, sort of around the middle of November in 2023. Where we see those bars start to increase, those sites either got a rain or those feeds were mulched and the regrowth was a lot better. And so they started to increase in quality again. If you look at metabolizable energy requirements for Phalaris, and again, our weaners and dry sheep in these scenarios require 8 megajoules a day. We started to see that significant decline in energy at the start of November. So by the 10th of November, a lot of those sites weren't meeting requirements, but by the end of November, nearly all of those sites weren't meeting requirements. So those two increases were due to either a rain event or those sites being mulched. Requirements on mixed pasture from this feed quality project. So there's been over 40 sites tested across, there's been over, I think 40 sites tested for these different varieties of pastures, and starting at the start of September through to whenever that season declined. So in 2023, that was around February, I believe. So again, if we look at the results out of that mixed pasture feed testing for crude protein, the blue line is our weaner sheep guide, 25 kilos growing at 100 grams a day. And the red line is our dry sheep requirement, a 50 kilo ewe at condition score 3. So once again, on mixed pastures, we start to see that significant decline in crude protein, requiring around 14% for weaners or 8% for ewes. That weaner feed starting to decline sort of well before the 21st of October. By the end of November, that crude protein requirement had significantly declined below maintenance requirement for those animals. And because they were increasing in NDF, that animal couldn't eat as much, and therefore their requirements weren't being met a lot earlier. If we look at energy requirements required at 8 megajoules, a lot of those sites dropped by the start of November. So essentially, if we are weaning later, then these feeds and the NDF percentage that they contain has a significant impact on feed intake, and therefore they're not getting the benefits of those high quality feeds earlier in that season. So really important to start feed testing at least by the 1st of October to ensure that the animal can physically eat enough of that feed to meet requirements. Crude protein percentage of annual grasses. So once again, started to drop off a lot earlier in terms of crude protein. So weren't meeting weaner requirements by the start of October. We've seen a lot of those sites significantly drop well below that 14% crude protein. And for our dry sheep, significant decline by the 13th of November. So if we're looking to wean later, be really mindful, even though those pastures might look okay, depending on what type of season we have, it's the fibre level and dropping intake that really affects weaners and average daily gain. Metabolizable energy of annuals significantly dropped by the start of September across most of those sites below that 8 megajoule requirement. They held on for a lot longer. So they may have had higher water-soluble carbohydrates, so sugars, earlier than a lot of the other species, but more testing needs to be done on annuals going forward. And then on legumes, we see here that blue line is our weaner requirements. The red line is our dry sheep requirements. Their quality held up for a lot longer, which is what you would expect from a legume type variety. So well above requirements for our weaner growing at 100 grams a day, and well above maintenance requirements for a lot longer through that period. So really only started to drop on one site by the end of November. So how do we plan ahead for the season? So once again, visual inspection's not enough to determine feed quality. So really, if you're setting up weaner paddocks and you're getting some growth, try not to eat into that growing point now because you'll have to supplementary feed for a lot longer later. But if we are setting up those paddocks to meet those pasture targets, make sure we start doing those feed tests sort of around the end of September, which is what the Feed Quality Project suggests, depending on the season, to determine where your NDF level's at, because it's that which limits intake, which affects our average daily gain. We want to feed test to determine the nutrient value. We can't visually see that, so we want to go through and make sure that we're looking at all of those nutrients, not just energy and protein, because there are other things in that feed test that tell you a lot more about the feed that you're feeding. Really important to weigh young stock. So if we are early weaning, we want to make sure that those weaners are growing at least at 100 grams, if not 150 grams a day, to really maximize their weight gains. And monitoring our ewes when we go to mark those lambs and at weaning. So getting a gauge on where your ewe condition score is will determine whether you need to early wean or not, plus your feed situation at hand post-weaning, post-marking. So really getting hands on ewes, if you've got time to do that through that marking process, sort of make time to get a gauge as to where those ewe mobs are sitting in terms of body condition score. So we allow them enough time to recover by joining. So the work out of the Lifetime Ewe Project suggests that for every increase in condition score from 2 to 3, we get around 20 extra lambs on average. It also pushes those ewes into producing a twin or conceiving a twin if they've got the genetic potential to do so. So we get a higher twinning percentage if we can push those ewes from a condition score 2 to a condition score 3 by the time the rams go in. Ewe recovery time is really important. It takes around 2 months on really good green feed to put on one body condition score. So if we don't have that, we need to allow enough time for that ewe to recover. So in a typical season where we are joining at, when we're weaning at 14 weeks, we've got a recovery time of 17 weeks, where we can wean earlier, then we have a longer recovery time. So being mindful that it does take 2 months to put on one body condition score on really lush, actively growing pasture. So if we don't have that, we want to allow enough time for that ewe to recover so our conception rates are high. Similar benefits with cattle, with cows. So we reduce the time to estrus by having them in better body condition when we go to join those cows as well. So we want to allow that cow enough time to regain or feed her at a higher requirement so that she can conceive, especially if she's got a calf at foot when we go to join her. Really important, if you haven't done so, to feed budget for the next 60 to 80 days. Don't bank on pasture being available. It will depend on the season conditions, what happens in the paddock. Try not to eat into that growing point if you can, because you'll be feeding for a lot longer post-spring if you are eating into that growing point, because it will slow down the rate of pasture growth. So we want to ensure that we separate our mobs into their livestock class, determine their live weight, their current body condition score and target. So you might wait to marking to do this feed budget. Determine current pasture quantity if you have any on hand, total grazing area, stock take, what supplements you've got left, identify any livestock you can sell earlier if you can, and then determine how much feed that you'll need to get through at least the next 8 weeks. So I've touched on the season. We've had a look at breeding stock requirements for July. The strategies to early wean is really about setting that rumen up to support survival rates post-weaning and then planning ahead up until joining. My details are on the website, or get in contact with Rob or Debbie if you wanted to discuss feed budgeting or look at your ration currently. And I'd just like to thank Perennial Pasture Systems for putting on the webinar today, a really topical issue, topic, and Glenelg Hopkins CMA for funding the event. And I'll hand back to Debbie. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess. Just like to thank everyone for listening in and remind those to spread the word that we will have this recorded and share at a future date. So do we have any questions from anyone? You can put your hand up or unmute yourself to ask the question. No, I can't see anything. You must have covered it very well, Jess. Yeah, I can't see any hands anywhere. Yep, Tim. Would you like to unmute, Tim? Yep, no, still can't hear
No,
you.
all right. No, I'm just waving my hand. Sorry, that's just me. That was a very good presentation, Jess.
Thanks, Tim. Sorry I couldn't answer
Yeah.
your call. I was doing the
No, that's all right.
presentation.
No, you were busy. Rob reminded me that it was on, so that was fantastic. So I'm glad I tuned in.
Yeah, if anyone's got any questions and want to know anything about their ration or feed budgeting, certainly get in contact with Rob or Debbie and they can pass my details on.
Certainly can. Thank you for that, Jess. And as Jess has explained, we have been supported with this through the Glenelg Hopkins CMA and the Australian government through the Sustainable Agriculture Facilitators, supported by the Australian government through funding from the National Heritage Trust under the Climate Smart Agriculture Program. So thank you for all that. And of course, the MLA PDSs that we've been doing, that Jess has been able to use the information to help with the figures on the webinar. So with all that, I'll close and thank you very much for attending.